February 23, 1945. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima was still hot from days of shelling. Smoke drifted like ghosts over the shattered island. And at Mount Suribachi, the island's southern tip, 6 Marines began their slow climb to the summit. Below them, the beaches were chaos, men digging foxholes under mortar fire, corpsmen dragging the wounded from burning landing craft, flamethrowers roaring against hidden bunkers. But this was not the story of that famous photograph. Not yet. This story began thousands of miles away, long before the flag went up on Suribachi. It began with men who had vanished from the world, swallowed by war and presumed dead, and with those who refused to let them die forgotten. In early 1942, when American and Filipino forces surrendered at Bataan, over 70,000 soldiers became prisoners of the Japanese. What followed was one of the darkest events in the Pacific War, the Bataan Death March. Thousands perished on that brutal trek north to the prison camps. Those who survived found themselves behind barbed wire in Cabanatuan, where disease, starvation, and execution awaited. By 1945, rumors reached American lines that hundreds of those men were still alive, barely. But the Japanese, retreating before MacArthur's advancing army, had orders. No prisoners were to fall into Allied hands alive. If captured, they were to be executed. Intelligence confirmed that Cabanatuan prison camp, deep in central Luzon, still held over 500 American prisoners, survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, the last remnants of the early war. Their condition was dire. Many weighed under 100 pounds. Some could no longer stand. The Japanese garrison guarding them was small, but nearby units numbered in the thousands. If liberation was to be attempted, it had to be done fast, and it had to be done in total secrecy. Colonel Henry Mucci, commander of the 6th Ranger Battalion, received the order from General Walter Kruger of the 6th Army. His mission: infiltrate 30 miles behind Japanese lines, rescue every single prisoner, and bring them out alive. If discovered too early, the Japanese would slaughter the captives before help could reach them. Failure was not an option, not morally, not strategically. Mucci chose Captain Robert Prince to lead the ground assault team, 120 Rangers, handpicked for endurance, discipline, and courage. To gather intelligence and guide the assault, Mucci enlisted the Alamo Scouts, elite reconnaissance specialists already operating behind enemy lines, and a network of Filipino guerrillas under Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Hoson. These guerrillas had been fighting the Japanese for 3 years. They knew the terrain, the patrol routes, and the local population. They understood that this mission was not just an American operation. It was a Filipino one too, born from shared suffering and shared hope. As the Rangers prepared to move out, they stripped down their packs. No extra gear, no heavy equipment. They would live off the land, move by night, and rely on speed and precision. They began their march from the American front lines near Guimba, Luzon, crossing rivers, crawling through kogon grass, and slipping past enemy patrols. Every step forward meant deeper into danger. By the night of January 28, 1945, the Rangers reached the village of Platero, just a few miles from the Cabanatuan camp. There, Captain Pajota awaited with critical intelligence. His spies had mapped every guard tower, every patrol schedule, even the locations of machine guns inside the camp. But there was a problem. Japanese reinforcements had moved into the area. Hundreds of troops were bivouacked nearby, and tanks were stationed along the main road. If the assault failed, the prisoners would die. If it succeeded, it would be one of the most daring rescues in military history. Prince studied the maps under the dim light of an oil lamp. The plan was simple on paper, but suicidal in execution. His 120 rangers would crawl through open fields toward the camp, 1,000 yards of flat, exposed ground. Any alarm, any gunshot too early, and the Japanese would slaughter the prisoners before the rangers could reach the gates. To create a diversion, the plan called for an American P-61 Black Widow night fighter to fly over the camp at low altitude. Its job was to distract the guards long enough for the rangers to get into position. Timing was everything. The assault would begin at exactly 1945 hours. The first shots would be fired into the guard towers. The rangers would then storm the gates, neutralize the garrison, and evacuate the prisoners through the northern perimeter. Meanwhile, Captain Pajota's 200 guerrillas would block the Kabu River Bridge to the west, the only route for Japanese reinforcements to reach the camp. Pajota's men would face armor, artillery, and infantry with almost no heavy weapons. But if they failed to hold the bridge, the entire rescue would collapse. As the sun set on January 30th, the operation began. At 1830 hours, the P-61 began its pass. It swooped low over the camp, engines roaring. Its pilot performing mock attacks and barrel rolls to draw every Japanese eye toward the sky. Guards stared upward, pointing, distracted by the unexpected noise. On the ground, 120 rangers crawled forward on their bellies, rifles clutched tight, blades of grass brushing their faces. They moved inch by inch across the field. The only sounds were insects and distant engines. Sweat ran into their eyes, but they dared not wipe it away. One mistake would mean 500 dead prisoners, and all of them knew it. When they reached the wire, Captain Prince checked his watch. 1945 hours. He whispered one word, "Now." The silence exploded. Rifle fire cut through the darkness. Every guard tower erupted in flames. The gate was blown open by a .45 pistol round to the lock. Rangers poured inside, firing into the barracks and pillboxes. The Japanese garrison never had a chance. Within 15 seconds, the camp was under American control. Inside the barracks, prisoners awoke in confusion. Some thought it was a Japanese trick. Others believed they were dreaming. Then they heard the voices, American accents, shouting, "We're here, you're free, get out." Some men wept. Others laughed or stared in disbelief. After 3 years of captivity, freedom had arrived in the form of men covered in mud and sweat, moving with lethal precision. But the hardest part was not the assault. It was the evacuation. Most prisoners were too weak to walk. They had suffered from beriberi, dysentery, malaria, and starvation. Rangers hoisted them onto their backs, carried them like children through the gate, through darkness and danger. Outside the camp, Pajota's guerrillas were already engaged. At the Kabu River Bridge, 200 Filipinos faced an entire Japanese battalion. Tanks rumbled down the road, infantry advancing in waves. Pajota's men dug in and opened fire. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and close. They fought with everything they had: rifles, grenades, and courage. 4 Japanese tanks tried to cross the bridge. Pajota's men, armed with only one anti-tank weapon, a single bazooka, waited until the lead tank reached the midpoint. Then a guerrilla who had never fired the weapon before took aim and pulled the trigger. The rocket struck dead center, turning the tank into a fireball. 3 more followed, all destroyed in quick succession. The bridge became a killing ground. For every Filipino who fell, 10 Japanese did. But still they came. Pajota's line bent but did not break. They held for 25 minutes against overwhelming odds, long enough for the prisoners to reach safety. By midnight, the impossible had been done. 516 prisoners were free. The rescue of Cabanatuan was complete. But the story did not end there. It continued through the long, perilous march to American lines, through rivers, jungles, and pursuit by Japanese patrols. It continued in the pain of survivors, the courage of their rescuers, and the unspoken bond between Americans and Filipinos who fought side by side for liberation. The night sky over Luzon was heavy with heat and fear. Behind them, Cabanatuan still burned, the faint glow of fire flickering over shattered watchtowers and crumpled barracks. Ahead, a dark trail wound through the rice paddies, the jungle whispering with unseen danger. The Rangers and their Filipino allies began the long, painful retreat toward American lines, carrying with them the living ghosts of Bataan. Each prisoner was a shell of the man he once was. Their legs trembled with every step. Some wore rags that barely clung to their skin. Others had no shoes at all, their feet raw and bleeding from years of neglect. But they moved, one step after another, supported by the men who had risked everything to free them. Captain Prince walked at the front, his rifle slung across his shoulder, constantly scanning the horizon. Behind him, Colonel Mucci checked on the wounded, whispering encouragement to men barely conscious. "You're safe now," he told one soldier whose eyes were glassy and unfocused. "You're going home." But home was still 30 miles away, through enemy territory, crawling with Japanese patrols. At dawn, the first rays of light revealed just how difficult their task would be. The men had crossed the Pampanga River in darkness, using makeshift rafts of bamboo. Now, as the sun broke through the mist, they were exposed. Every open field could mean discovery. Overhead, a Japanese reconnaissance plane buzzed low, its engine droning like a warning. The column froze under the trees, hearts pounding, until the sound faded into the distance. The Filipino guerrillas scouted ahead, moving silently through the brush. They found enemy patrols on several roads, forcing the convoy to take detours through swamps and thickets. Prisoners stumbled and fell. Some begged to be left behind, but no one was abandoned. Rangers took turns carrying them, men on shoulders, men dragged on improvised stretchers, their bodies weightless from starvation. Every ranger carried more than 60 extra pounds, rifles, ammunition, food, and another man's life. When night fell, they reached the village of Balancaran. Locals came out from the shadows, their faces lit by lanterns. They brought food, water, and blankets. The villagers whispered prayers, touching the hands of the liberated soldiers as if to make sure they were real. For 3 years, these Filipinos had watched prisoners marched past their homes under the Japanese whip. Now, they wept as they gave what little they had to keep the rescued men alive. Further north, Captain Pajota's guerrillas still held their ground, fending off Japanese reinforcements trying to push across the Kabu River. Smoke and fire lit the horizon as explosions echoed through the jungle. Pajota's men were exhausted, running low on ammunition, but they refused to fall back. For every minute they held, the prisoners gained another 100 yards of freedom. By the second night, the column was deep in the countryside, moving through the foothills near Talavera. They could finally rest, but not for long. Scouts reported Japanese pursuit units closing in from the south and east. Colonel Mucci made the decision. They would push on without sleep. The weak were loaded onto carabao carts, pulled by villagers who volunteered to help, even knowing what the punishment would be if they were caught. As they moved, the jungle seemed alive with unseen eyes. Every sound, a branch snapping, a leaf rustling, made fingers tighten on triggers. Then, in the early hours of January 31st, just before dawn, they saw them, the first American tanks of the 37th Infantry Division. The rescue column broke into cheers. Some cried, some fell to their knees. For many prisoners, it was the first sight of the American flag in 3 years. The tank's crews, seeing the emaciated figures stumbling from the trees, were struck silent. One officer later wrote that he could hardly believe they were human, more skeleton than man. Medics rushed forward with stretchers, blankets, and food. The prisoners were given chocolate, canned milk, and medical care. Some ate too fast and had to be restrained, their bodies too fragile to handle real food after years of starvation. By noon, the entire group, 516 rescued prisoners, 120 rangers, and 200 Filipino guerrillas, reached safety behind American lines. Not one prisoner had been lost. When General MacArthur received the report, he was stunned. He called it one of the most daring and successful rescues in modern history. News of the raid spread through the Allied world like wildfire. For the first time in years, the men who had suffered in the early defeats of the Pacific War were heroes again. The operation sent a message far beyond the battlefield. The United States never forgets its own. But the cost was high, and not just in bullets or blood. For the Rangers, the memory of that night never faded. Many would later say that nothing in their lives compared to the moment they lifted a dying man from the mud and carried him into freedom. For the Filipinos, the cost was measured in lives lost in retribution. The Japanese, enraged by the raid, executed civilians in nearby villages, suspecting them of aiding the Americans. War had given them no mercy, but it could not erase their courage. The rescue at Cabanatuan became legend, a story told in whispers among the liberated, then in headlines across the world. But for those who were there, it was not about glory. It was about duty, brotherhood, and the quiet determination to bring every man home. In the months that followed, as American forces advanced through the Philippines, other prison camps were liberated, but none with the same precision, coordination, and courage as Cabanatuan. Of the 120 Rangers who took part, only 2 would die in the mission. Among the prisoners rescued were doctors, engineers, chaplains, and ordinary soldiers who had survived unimaginable hardship. Some would live to see Japan surrender later that year. Others, broken in body, but not in spirit, would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. When the survivors finally returned home, newspapers called them the ghosts of Bataan. Their families had long since received telegrams declaring them missing or dead. Now, suddenly, they were alive, walking back into a world that had moved on without them. One prisoner, when asked what freedom felt like, simply said, "It felt like light after endless darkness." The raid at Cabanatuan was more than a military success. It was a testament to what humanity can endure and what courage can achieve. Filipinos and Americans fought side by side, united not by uniform or command, but by compassion and purpose. The jungle that once echoed with gunfire now holds their memory, a reminder that in war, even the smallest acts of bravery can change the course of history. The jungle was silent again. The gunfire had faded, and the smoke had long since drifted into the evening sky. But for the men who had lived through that night, both rescuers and rescued, the echoes of Cabanatuan would never fade. For some, freedom was overwhelming. The silence of the American field hospitals felt foreign after years of prison screams and brutality. Nurses described the rescued men as haunted, their eyes searching corners of quiet rooms for guards who no longer existed. Many couldn't sleep in beds. They lay on the floor, wrapped in thin blankets, as if still behind barbed wire. Some flinched at the sound of footsteps. Others wept silently at the sight of food they could finally eat. Doctors documented cases of malnutrition so severe that bones had become porous, ribs like paper, hearts weak from years of starvation. Yet somehow, they had survived. The press soon arrived, filling tents and hospitals with cameras and questions. Were you beaten? How did you survive? What did the Japanese do to you? But the survivors rarely spoke of their suffering. They spoke instead of the men who hadn't made it, those buried in shallow graves at Camp O'Donnell, or left on the road during the Bataan Death March. One man, former POW Captain Bill Gibson, told a reporter quietly, "The real heroes are the ones who never came home." In Washington, the raid electrified the nation. The story ran on front pages across America. Rangers free prisoners from Japanese camp. Families who had long since given up hope rushed to telephones and telegram offices, desperate to learn if their loved ones were among the rescued. Mothers fainted upon hearing their sons were alive. Fathers wept openly for the first time. The raid had done more than save 500 men. It had restored faith in the army, in the mission, in the very soul of a war that had begun with so much loss. For General MacArthur, the operation was proof that his promise, "I shall return," was more than words. It was a living vow fulfilled in blood and brotherhood. In his private report to Washington, MacArthur wrote, "The Rangers and their Filipino allies have covered themselves with glory. The rescue of these men from certain death stands as a symbol of American valor and Filipino loyalty." Meanwhile, in Japan, the reaction was fury. The Cabanatuan raid humiliated the Imperial Command. Orders went out to increase security at every POW camp in the Pacific. Some prisoners elsewhere were executed out of spite, but the ripple was already unstoppable. In the eyes of the world, the myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked. The Cabanatuan raid had shown that even deep behind enemy lines, under occupation, surrounded, and outnumbered, the Allies could strike with precision and bring their men home. And for the Filipino guerrillas, whose courage was often forgotten by the world, it was a moment of pride. In Luzon's small villages, where mothers had lost sons to retribution and soldiers had fought without pay or recognition, word spread. The Americans remembered us. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the survivors of Cabanatuan began to rebuild their lives. But for many, peace was not simple. Some never recovered from their injuries. Others returned home to find families gone, homes lost, and lives waiting that no longer fit. There were reunions filled with joy and others filled with silence. Wives who had remarried after receiving death notices suddenly found themselves face to face with husbands they believed dead. Children, grown older, met fathers they could barely remember. Time had stolen too much, and yet, through all the quiet pain, a brotherhood endured. The men of the 6th Ranger Battalion and the surviving POWs kept in touch for decades. They met at reunions, exchanged letters, told stories to their grandchildren. Each year, fewer came, but those who did still spoke with reverence of that night in January 1945. For years after the war, the Filipino guerrillas who fought alongside the Rangers were rarely mentioned in official records. Men like Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Hoson, whose quick thinking and bravery had made the raid possible, returned home to poverty without medals, without recognition. It took decades for their courage to be formally acknowledged. In the early 2000s, surviving Filipino veterans were finally honored by both the United States and the Philippines for their role in the liberation. By then, most had already passed away. Their children accepted the medals, not as symbols of glory, but as proof that their fathers' sacrifices had not been forgotten. In the years that followed, the Cabanatuan raid became the subject of books, films, and documentaries, from Back to Bataan in 1945 to the Great Raid in 2005. But no film could truly capture what it meant to those who were there. Because the Cabanatuan raid was not just a story of guns and tactics, it was a story of faith, of men who refused to abandon one another, even in hell. In every version, one truth remains: the rescue was not born of orders or strategy, but of humanity. In 1992, one of the last surviving rangers, Alvy Robbins, visited the site of the old Cabanatuan camp. The jungle had reclaimed it. Grass grew over the ruins. The guard towers were gone. But standing there, he could still see it: the fences, the barracks, the faces of men staring out through wire. He whispered, "God, let us bring them home." A local farmer guided him to a quiet spot under a mango tree where a plaque now stood. It read, "Here, men of the United States Army and the Filipino guerrillas risked their lives to free their comrades." Robbins stood for a long time, hat in hand, before he said softly, "They didn't die forgotten." What made the raid unforgettable was not its military brilliance, though it was that, but its heart. It was a story of men who chose to risk everything for strangers they'd never met. A story of people, Filipino civilians, rangers, medics, and scouts, united by a single belief: that no man should be left behind. In that sense, Cabanatuan wasn't just an operation. It was a statement, one that still echoes through every rescue mission, every pledge to bring soldiers home, every flag folded at a soldier's grave. When the sun rises over Nueva Ecija today, it glows over rice fields where the camp once stood. The land is quiet now, but beneath that silence lies a history that shaped the soul of a nation. Cabanatuan was more than a raid. It was proof that courage isn't born in power, it's born in compassion. That freedom isn't given, it's fought for, one step at a time in the dark. And that even in war, humanity can shine brighter than fear. So as you watch this story fade into history, remember the men who walked through the night, carrying others on their shoulders, guided only by hope. Their footsteps still echo. Their sacrifice still speaks, and their story will never be forgotten. If this story moved you, if you felt the courage, the pain, and the triumph of those who lived it, then stay with us. Subscribe and join us again as we uncover the untold stories of World War II. Stories of valor, sacrifice, and the fragile line between death and deliverance. Watch our next documentary, another forgotten chapter of history, brought back to life. Because the past still has a voice, and we're here to make sure it's never silenced.